The war in Afghanistan, a legacy of conflict and consequences. The war in Afghanistan was one of the longest and most complex conflicts in modern history, spanning from 2001 to 2021. It involved multiple nations, shifting alliances, and devastating consequences for millions of people. This war was ignited by the 9/11 attacks, leading to a US-led invasion aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and overthrowing the Taliban regime. However, what was expected to be a swift victory turned into a two-decade-long war filled with insurgency, counterterrorism operations, and political instability. The invasion, Operation Enduring Freedom, 2001. On October 7, 2001, the United States and its allies launched Operation Enduring Freedom, targeting Taliban strongholds and al-Qaeda training camps. The initial phase of the war saw rapid advances, with Kabul falling by November. Taliban fighters retreated into the mountains, but the U.S. underestimated their resilience. By December, al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden escaped from Tora Bora, slipping into Pakistan. This marked the beginning of a prolonged and frustrating conflict. The rise of the insurgency, 2003 to 2006. Despite initial successes, the war took a new turn as the Taliban regrouped. By 2003, they launched a full-fledged insurgency using guerrilla warfare, suicide bombings, and IEDs, improvised explosive devices, to target U.S. and NATO forces. Afghanistan's terrain made it difficult for conventional armies to maintain control, and rural areas became Taliban strongholds once again. Pakistan's role also became controversial, with allegations that the Taliban found sanctuary across the border. The surge and NATO's role, 2007 to 2011. As violence escalated, the Bush administration increased troop levels, and by 2009, President Barack Obama launched a troop surge, deploying 30,000 additional soldiers. NATO forces, including the UK, Canada, Germany, and Australia, took part in combat missions, attempting to stabilize the country. However, insurgents adapted quickly, employing asymmetric warfare, including hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and attacks on government officials. By 2011, the war saw a major turning point: the U.S. Navy SEALs raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan, which killed Osama bin Laden. Although a symbolic victory, it did not end the war. The Taliban, now fractured but persistent, continued their attacks. The long road to withdrawal, 2012 to 2020. As the war dragged on, public opinion in the U.S. and allied nations shifted, with growing demands to end military involvement. In 2014, NATO formally ended combat operations and transitioned to a training and advisory role under Operation Resolute Support. However, the Afghan government struggled to maintain security, with the Taliban steadily gaining territory. Peace talks were initiated, but little progress was made. In February 2020, under President Donald Trump, the Doha Agreement was signed with the Taliban, outlining a withdrawal of U.S. troops in exchange for Taliban commitments to cut ties with terrorist groups. However, as the withdrawal process began under President Joe Biden, the Taliban swiftly took advantage of the power vacuum. The fall of Kabul and Taliban takeover, 2021. On August 15, 2021, in a shocking turn of events, the Taliban seized Kabul, leading to a chaotic evacuation of U.S. and NATO personnel, diplomats, and Afghan allies. The Afghan government collapsed, and President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. The world watched in disbelief as thousands of Afghans desperately tried to escape, crowding the Kabul airport in a humanitarian crisis. Consequences of the war. The war left over 240,000 people dead, including civilians, military personnel, and insurgents. The economic cost exceeded $2 trillion, making it one of the most expensive wars in history. Despite years of investment in Afghan institutions, the government collapsed within weeks after U.S. withdrawal, raising questions about the effectiveness of nation-building efforts. The role of the Afghan army and government. The Afghan National Army, ANA, was heavily trained and funded by the U.S. and NATO allies. However, corruption, poor leadership, and low morale significantly weakened its effectiveness. Despite billions in military aid, Afghan forces struggled to counter the Taliban's guerrilla tactics. Many soldiers surrendered without resistance during the Taliban's final offensive in 2021. The quick collapse of the ANA was one of the most shocking aspects of the war's conclusion. The humanitarian crisis. With the Taliban back in power, Afghanistan has faced an economic collapse, food shortages, and human rights abuses. Women's rights, which had seen progress during the U.S. occupation, were drastically rolled back. Girls were barred from education, and women were forced out of many professions. Millions of Afghans have fled the country, seeking refuge in neighboring nations or attempting to immigrate to Europe and North America. Terrorism and regional security threats. The resurgence of the Taliban has also led to concerns about Afghanistan becoming a breeding ground for terrorist organizations like ISIS-K. The group carried out devastating attacks, including the Kabul airport bombing in August 2021, which killed over 180 people, including U.S. troops. The Taliban has vowed to combat ISIS-K, but global security experts remain skeptical about Afghanistan's stability. Impact on U.S. and NATO credibility. The chaotic withdrawal of U.S. troops and the Taliban's rapid takeover damaged America's global reputation. Allies questioned U.S. reliability, and adversaries, including Russia and China, capitalized on the perceived weakness. The war also reignited debates about U.S. military interventions and whether nation-building efforts in foreign countries are viable long-term strategies. The future of Afghanistan. Under Taliban rule, Afghanistan has seen severe human rights restrictions, particularly for women and minorities. The country faces economic collapse, international isolation, and an ongoing humanitarian crisis. Meanwhile, terrorist threats from groups like ISIS-K persist, keeping global security concerns alive. The situation remains unstable, with new resistance movements forming against the Taliban, as well as increasing global pressure for humanitarian aid. Some Afghan citizens and former military personnel have joined underground movements, fighting for a more democratic future. Whether Afghanistan can ever stabilize under Taliban rule or if another phase of resistance will emerge remains an open question. Conclusion. The war in Afghanistan will be remembered as a conflict marked by unmet objectives, shifting strategies, and profound human suffering. While the war ended in 2021, its implications on global politics, security, and humanitarian efforts will shape history for years to come. Loudspeaker, what do you think about the Afghanistan war? Was it justified or a failure? Let's discuss in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more war history content.